Bears have ruled the wild for thousands of years, their strength unmatched, their instincts honed for survival. A single swipe of their claws can rip through flesh, their powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. Most avoid humans, but when hunger, territory, or fear drive them to attack, they become unstoppable forces of nature. In those moments, the wilderness reminds us who truly owns it. Here are 6 stories. The Volga Peninsula in Russia had always been a harsh and unforgiving place. Still, in March of 1985, it became the site of one of the most chilling wilderness tragedies ever recorded. The vast, snow-covered expanse of land was home to some of the largest brown bears in the world. Ferocious, territorial, and now dangerously hungry. That winter had been particularly brutal, with food scarce and the predators growing desperate. The normally abundant salmon had not returned in their usual numbers, and the smaller prey the bears relied on had either migrated or perished under the relentless cold. Viktor Petrov and Ivan Mikhailov, 2 seasoned hunters, were part of a 10-man group that ventured deep into the forest on what should have been a routine hunting expedition. The men were well acquainted with the terrain and its dangers, but believed their experience and firepower would keep them safe. Their rifles were loaded and their senses were sharp, yet nothing could have prepared them for what awaited. The hunt had been uneventful for most of the day. The men had set up camp near a partially frozen river, confident in their position. It was a spot they had used, a familiar place offering protection from the elements. Their tents were sturdy, their fire roaring, and their food supplies well stocked. They joked about past expeditions, shared drinks, and returned home with stories of great hunts. The men had heard rumors of aggressive bear activity, but none paid it much attention. After all, they were some of the region's best hunters. What could go wrong? Unbeknownst to them, they were not alone. A grizzly, abnormally large and dangerously thin from starvation, had caught their scent. It had been tracking them for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This was no ordinary bear. It was a desperate predator, pushed beyond its instincts by the cruel hand of winter. It had already begun hunting humans, drawn to their campsites by the scent of food and flesh, and now it had found its next victims. Just as darkness fully set in, the first attack came. The bear moved with a terrifying speed that defied its massive size. The first hunter to fall didn't even have time to react. One moment, he was tending the fire. The next, he was on the ground, lifeless, his throat torn open. The others barely had a second to register what had happened before the bear struck again. A second man was lifted off his feet and thrown like a rag doll against a tree, his skull shattering on impact. Blood sprayed against the snow, steam rising in the freezing air. The campsite erupted into chaos. Rifles were grabbed, but fear and confusion rendered them useless. The bear was relentless, attacking with the force of a hurricane, swiping men aside as though they were mere twigs. Some fired blindly into the darkness, their bullets missing their mark as the bear weaved through the camp, its roars echoing through the forest. 9 of them died in less than 2 minutes. Blood stained the snow as the beast crushed bones and shredded flesh with its powerful jaws. Viktor and Ivan barely managed to react in time. Their instincts kicked in, and they scrambled toward the nearest tree, climbing as fast as their trembling limbs allowed. They watched in paralyzed horror from their vantage point as the bear continued its rampage below. The beast didn't leave immediately. It circled the remains of the camp, sniffing at the bodies, letting out deep guttural growls as if challenging any survivors to come down. It tore into the provisions, scattering supplies and shredding tents. The sound of crunching bones filled the air as it feasted on the remains of the fallen hunters. Minutes stretched into hours, and still the bear lingered. Victor and Ivan clung to the branches, barely breathing, their hands frozen, their minds numb with terror. The grizzly finally lost interest sometime before dawn and wandered off into the darkness. The two men remained in the tree until the first rays of morning light touched the forest. Only then did they dare to descend, their legs stiff and their bodies aching. What lay before them was a massacre. Friends and fellow hunters torn apart, their rifles and supplies trampled into the blood-stained snow. The once peaceful campsite was now an open grave. They didn't waste time. The journey back to the nearest village was desperate, their every step haunted by the fear that the bear might return. The trek through the dense forest was brutal. The cold seeped into their bones, and exhaustion threatened to pull them under. Their supplies had been left behind, their water frozen solid. Every snapping twig sent a fresh wave of panic through their bodies. The forest silence was deafening, each step feeling like an eternity. After what felt like days but was only a handful of grueling hours, they finally stumbled into civilization, breathless and frostbitten. The villagers listened in stunned silence as they recounted the night's horror. Some wept for the fallen hunters, others whispered prayers. The elders exchanged worried glances, their expressions grim. They had heard stories like this before, tales passed down through generations about bears that had tasted human flesh and never stopped hunting. A hunting party was sent to track the beast in the following days. They found the remains of the camp, but no sign of the bear itself. The tracks led deeper into the wilderness, disappearing into the untouched snow. Some claimed it had moved further into the mountains, while others whispered that such a creature could not be killed by ordinary means. The legend of the demon of Volkhya was born, and to this day, hunters venturing into the region tell the story as both a warning and a reminder of nature's merciless rule. Victor and Ivan never returned to that part of the forest. The nightmares followed them for the rest of their lives. Once a man of steady hands and unwavering resolve, Victor flinched at the sound of rustling leaves. Once proud and fearless, Ivan took solace in the safety of city life, never again setting foot in the wilderness. The bear had taken more than their friends, their peace of mind and sense of security. The forest remained silent in the years that followed. Some said the bear had perished, unable to survive the next winter. Others believed it still roamed the depths of Volkhya, waiting for its next hunt. To this day, when the wind howls through the trees at night, the villagers say it carries the echoes of the fallen hunters, their voices lost in the wild, forever warning those who dare venture too far into the unknown. The frozen wilderness of the Yukon Valley in Canada was a place of brutal beauty, an expanse of untouched snow and towering evergreens that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The winters were long and merciless, a season of silence broken only by the howling wind and the distant calls of predators. On March 2, 1997, a group of local trappers would encounter something far more dangerous than the bitter cold. Daniel McGregor and Peter Sullivan had spent their lives in the Yukon, men hardened by the elements and seasoned in the ways of the wild. They had hunted grizzlies before, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would face on that ill-fated expedition. Their party consisted of 10 men, all experienced trappers, each carrying rifles and provisions for a week-long trek deep into the valley. The goal was simple: locate the grizzly preying on local livestock and eliminate the threat before it turned its attention to humans. Rumors of a monstrous bear had circulated among the villagers for months. Ranchers spoke in hushed tones of cattle torn apart in ways that suggested something far more violent than a typical predator attack. Some even claimed to have seen the beast, an enormous grizzly, its fur ragged, its eyes dark with an unnatural rage. But Daniel and Peter dismissed these stories as exaggerations. A bear was a bear, no matter its size. Their journey into the valley began smoothly. The men moved with the practiced ease of those who knew the land well. The snowfall was light, the skies clear, and the tracks they followed were fresh. They felt confident they would see the beast before the week was out. But as the second day stretched into evening, the weather suddenly turned. The wind picked up, and a heavy snowfall descended, reducing visibility to near zero. The men had no choice but to camp and wait out the storm. They built a fire, huddled in their tents, and spoke little. There was an unspoken unease among them. Something about the storm felt unnatural, as if it had arrived not by chance but by design. Outside, beyond the fire's glow, the forest was impossibly dark, and then they heard it just as they began to drift into an uneasy sleep. A low, guttural growl, close. Before anyone could react, the bear was upon them. The first man never had a chance. One moment he was sitting near the fire, the next he was gone, dragged into the darkness with a blood-curdling scream. The camp erupted into chaos. Rifles were grabbed and shots were fired blindly into the storm, but the bear was relentless. It moved with a terrifying speed, weaving between the men, striking before they could properly aim. Another trapper was lifted off his feet and slammed into a tree, his skull caving in from the force. The snow turned red. Daniel and Peter watched in horror as their companions were torn apart, one by one. 9 men were dead in under 2 minutes, their bodies scattered across the snow like discarded dolls. The bear, its muzzle drenched in blood, stood amidst the carnage, its breath steaming in the frigid air. It did not retreat. It did not flee into the woods as a normal predator might. It stood there watching, as if daring the last 2 survivors to run. And run they did. They sprinted blindly through the storm, their bodies numb with terror and cold. They did not stop to think, did not stop to check if the bear was following. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. Only then did they collapse beneath a fallen log, burying themselves in the snow, praying that the beast would not find them. Hours passed, the wind howled, the snow piled higher, and then, at last, silence. When morning came, Daniel and Peter emerged from their hiding place, half frozen and barely able to stand. They retraced their steps back to camp, finding only devastation in their wake. The bear was gone, but the evidence of its massacre remained. Bodies lay where they had fallen, their faces twisted in agony, their rifles useless beside them. The fire had long since died, leaving only smoldering embers beneath the snowfall. Shaken and broken, the 2 men made their way back to the village, arriving half-starved and delirious. Their story sent shock waves through the town. No one wanted to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. A hunting party was formed, the largest the valley had ever seen. They tracked the bear for days, following its blood-stained path into the heart of the wilderness. When they finally caught up to it, they found it resting in a cave, its belly swollen from the feast it had made of the hunters. It took dozens of bullets to bring the beast down. Even in death, it seemed impossibly large, filling the cave like a shadow that refused to fade. Inside its stomach, they found remains, bones, scraps of clothing, a human skull. The villagers buried their dead, but they could not bury the legend. The Terror of Yukon Valley story remained one of Canada's most chilling wilderness tales. Those who ventured too deep into the valley did so cautiously, knowing that the wild remembered and the land didn't forget. And sometimes when the wind howled through the trees, it carried with it the echoes of that fateful night, the screams of the fallen, the growl of the beast, and the unshakable feeling that something still lingers in the dark. Blackthorn Isle, Alaska, was known for its towering grizzlies, beasts that could stand over 10 feet tall and weigh more than 1,500 pounds. The land was wild, untamed, and unforgiving, a place where only the most seasoned hunters and survivalists dared to venture. On March 2, 1972, a wildlife documentary crew arrived on the island, eager to observe these magnificent predators. They would find more than they bargained for. An ambitious photographer, Charles Whitman, had been planning this expedition for years. Alongside him was Henry Boyle, a seasoned guide who knew the island better than anyone. Their team consisted of 5 others, cameramen, assistants, and researchers, each excited by the prospect of witnessing one of nature's most formidable carnivores. The grizzlies of Blackthorn were known for their immense size and unpredictable temperaments, but the crew was confident. They had experience, they had equipment, they had Henry. The first few days were spent scouting locations, setting up along known grizzly trails, and observing the island's rugged beauty. The dense forest, rolling hills, and icy rivers made for breathtaking scenery. They watched from a distance, careful not to disturb the bears they encountered. But Charles wanted more. He wanted close-ups, raw, intimate experiences with a blackthorn grizzly in its natural element. He pushed the team further inland, deeper into the bear's territory. On the 4th day, they found the tracks, massive paw prints in the mud, larger than anything Henry had ever seen. The prints led toward a secluded riverbank, a perfect feeding ground. Excitement coursed through the crew as they positioned themselves quietly, waiting for a bear to appear. Hours passed, the wind howled through the trees. The sun dipped lower in the sky. Then, without warning, the bear emerged. It was unlike any grizzly they had seen before. It was enormous, its fur matted with mud and scars, its eyes dark and unrelenting. There was an intelligence in its gaze, something more than instinct, something unnerving. Henry whispered for the crew to stay still, to remain calm, but Charles, overcome with excitement, adjusted his stance and inched closer. The bear charged. The first attack was swift. One of the cameramen was caught in the initial onslaught and knocked to the ground before he could even scream. The others scrambled, grabbing what they could and running in all directions. Henry fired his rifle, the shot echoing through the valley, but it barely slowed the beast. It tore through the crew like a hurricane of teeth and claws. Charles ran, his breath ragged. He reached a tree and scrambled up, his fingers numb with fear. Below, he saw Henry trying to lure the bear away, waving his arms, shouting, firing another round. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The bear turned its massive head toward Henry, fixing him with an unreadable expression. And then it pounced. Henry disappeared beneath the grizzly's weight, his screams cut short. Charles could only watch, his body trembling as the bear mauled the only man who truly understood this land. The remaining crew members were either dead or missing. The attack had lasted only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The bear sniffed the air, its breath heavy. It looked up at Charles, eyes locking onto him through the branches. But then, as suddenly as it had attacked, it turned and vanished into the trees, leaving behind a scene of carnage. Charles stayed in the tree until morning, too terrified to move. When he finally climbed down, the silence was deafening. He wandered through the wreckage of their camp, the ground stained with blood, the equipment shattered. Henry's body was gone. The others were nowhere to be found. He stumbled toward the river, his mind reeling, and followed the water downstream. It took 2 days before he reached the coast, where a passing fishing boat found him, exhausted, delirious, and unable to explain what had happened. When he finally told his story, few believed him. Without any physical evidence beyond his own wounds and trauma, skeptics dismissed his claims as hysteria, a bear attack exaggerated by fear and grief. But the locals knew better. They had heard the old stories, the warnings passed down through generations about a bear that was more than just an animal. They spoke of an ancient predator that had claimed more lives than anyone could count. Old fishermen recalled tales of missing trappers. Their campsites were found torn apart, and their bodies never recovered. Hunters whispered about a bear too large, cunning, and ruthless to be of this world. It was a beast that did not just kill, it hunted, stalked, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. One elder told Charles that his encounter was not an accident. The bear had been watching them long before they saw its tracks. It had chosen them the moment they set foot in its domain. He warned that those who saw the blackthorn beast never truly left the island. Even if they escaped with their lives, the bear remained with them in their dreams, in the shadows, always waiting. Charles tried to move on. He returned to the mainland, abandoning his career as a wildlife photographer. He could not bear to be near the wilderness again, knowing what lurked beyond civilization's edge. But the nightmares followed him. Every night, he found himself back on the island, running, hiding, hearing the guttural growl of the bear closing in behind him. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced that if he ever set foot in the wilderness again, the blackthorn beast would be waiting for him. Years passed, and still the story of the blackthorn beast endured. New hunters came to the island, some dismissing the tale as mere folklore, others heeding the warnings. Some returned with trophies, proof that the grizzlies of Blackthorn were as real as any predator. But occasionally a hunter would vanish without a trace, their campsites eerily similar to the one Charles had left behind. Torn tents, blood-stained snow, and tracks leading into the wilderness, where no human dared follow. The legend of the Blackthorn beast was not just a story, it was a reminder, a warning. And for those who listened closely when the wind howled through the trees, they swore they could still hear it. The low, guttural growl of a predator that never forgot its prey. The Voronezh Expanse is one of the most unforgiving places on Earth, a vast, snow-covered wilderness stretching for thousands of miles, where winter never truly loosens its grip. It is a place where survival depends on strength, skill, and sheer willpower. In March of 1968, Soviet officers stationed at a remote outpost in the Expanse learned that nature does not compromise. Sergei Kozlov and Pavel Antonov were selected for an advanced survival training exercise. The Soviet military often sent its soldiers into the harshest environments to prepare them for extreme conditions. This was supposed to be just another routine operation. Navigate the frozen landscape, test their endurance, and return to base in a few days. But as they ventured deeper into the Expanse, they became aware that they were not alone. The winter had been particularly severe that year. Food was scarce, and reports had surfaced of a massive grizzly prowling the region. Unlike the typical brown bears of the Expanse, this one was different. The locals spoke of it hushedly, calling it Zver iz Tami, the beast from the dark. It was said to be larger than any bear ever recorded, its fur black as night, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. The officers, hardened men trained for war, dismissed the stories as superstition. Armed with rifles, they believed themselves untouchable. They were wrong. The first few days of the expedition were uneventful, but an eerie tension hung over the group. The cold was punishing, each breath forming icy clouds that lingered in the air. Their food rations were dwindling faster than expected, and the dense forest seemed unnaturally silent, as if the usual sounds of the wild had been swallowed by something unseen. It wasn't until the third evening that they realized something was following them. It started with strange disturbances. Their supplies were tampered with, rations tore open, footprints circling their campsite. At first, they suspected wolves, but the sheer size of the tracks ruled out any ordinary predator. The men kept their weapons close, their senses on high alert. On the second night, while the men huddled around their fire, an eerie silence fell over the camp. The usual sounds of the forest, branches creaking, distant howls, vanished. The men exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons tighter. Then, without warning, a blood-curdling roar shattered the stillness. The bear attacked with terrifying speed and precision. It crashed through the trees, its massive form barely visible in the dim firelight. The first man barely had time to scream before a single swipe of its paw sent him flying into the darkness, his body torn apart. Another soldier fired a shot, the bullet finding its mark, but the beast barely flinched. Panic set in. The men scattered, some trying to take cover behind trees, others attempting to climb them. The bear was relentless. It tore through them, a force of nature driven by starvation and fury. In less than 2 minutes, 9 men lay dead in the snow, their blood staining the frozen ground. Sergei and Pavel were the only ones left. They ran blindly, the sound of their ragged breathing drowning out everything else. They knew the bear was following. They could hear its heavy footfalls behind them, the crunch of snow under its enormous weight. They only hoped to reach an abandoned supply shed they had passed earlier. Their lungs burned and their legs threatened to surrender, but they pushed on. The shed came into view, a small, dilapidated structure barely standing against the elements. They lunged for the door, slamming it shut as the bear reached them. It crashed into the wood, shaking the walls and roaring in frustration. The bear clawed at the door for hours, ramming the walls, trying to break through. The men held their breath, knowing there would be no escape if the creature got inside. But as dawn approached, the sounds finally stopped. When they dared to look outside, the bear was gone, its massive footprints leading back into the wilderness. Reinforcements arrived later that day. The scene they found was gruesome, bodies torn apart, rifles shattered, the snow soaked with blood. The bear's tracks stretched deep into the expanse, disappearing into the endless white. The beast from the dark was never found. Some say it perished that winter, unable to sustain itself. Others believe it still roams the expanse, a phantom of the cold, waiting for the next unlucky souls to cross its path. Sergei and Pavel never spoke of that night again, but in the years that followed, soldiers stationed in the expanse would sometimes wake in the dead of night to the sound of distant guttural growls, echoes of something ancient that refused to die. They suffered nightmares and visions of the bear's dark eyes watching them from the forest's edge. Sergei found himself unable to return to the wilderness, retiring from service and seeking refuge in the city, far from the reaches of the expanse. Pavel, however, could not escape the pull of the wild. He returned to the expanse years later, driven by an obsession to find answers. He was never seen again. The legend grew. Locals whispered about the soldiers who had disturbed something old. something that had ruled the frozen forest long before men had set foot there. Hunters who dared to track the bear never returned. Their camps were found eerily similar to that of the fallen soldiers: shredded tents, discarded weapons, and blood staining the snow. Years later, a group of geologists working in the area stumbled upon something chilling. In a remote cave deep within the heart of the expanse, they found the remnants of an old military uniform torn and stained with time. Nearby, enormous claw marks scarred the rock, like something had once tried to dig its way out. There were no human remains, but they found something else: a massive, ancient grizzly skull, larger than any known specimen. The skull was taken for study, but before it could be transported, the research team suffered an unexpected accident. A sudden blizzard swept through the area, trapping them for days. When help arrived, only one man was found alive, delirious and frostbitten, mumbling incoherent warnings about a shadow in the storm. The skull had vanished. Old hunters in the region still refuse to speak of the beast from the dark. Some say it is still out there, its spirit bound to the frozen wilderness, waiting for another unlucky group to stumble into its domain. Others believe it was never just a bear, something else entirely, something beyond human understanding. But one thing remains certain: the expanse does not forget. And for those who dare venture too deep, the snow remembers the spilled blood. The dense forests of Blackwood Island, Canada, have long been home to some of the largest grizzlies in North America. Hunters, trappers, and loggers have navigated its wilderness for centuries, but few encounters are as terrifying as the one on March 2, 1955. It was a story that would become legend, a tale whispered in hunting lodges and around campfires, a warning to those who thought themselves masters of the wild. Joseph Carter, a retired game warden, had spent decades tracking and studying the bears of British Columbia. He had heard rumors of an unusually aggressive grizzly, one responsible for the disappearance of several trappers over the past winter. Some claimed it was a myth, a story to keep outsiders from venturing too deep into the forest. But when reports of mutilated livestock and torn-apart cabins surfaced, Joseph decided to investigate. He was not alone. His nephew, Robert Carter, eager to prove himself as a hunter, joined him. Along with a small group of experienced woodsmen, they ventured into the remote mountains, following deep claw marks and massive paw prints that led them into the heart of the island's wilderness. At first, the trail was easy to follow, but as they moved further in, the tracks became erratic, as if the bear was toying with them, leading them deeper into its domain. By the third day, an uneasy tension had settled over the group. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves and birds chirping, had vanished. It was as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Joseph, relying on his years of experience, knew something was wrong. They were being watched. Then, at dusk, the attack came. The grizzly struck with horrifying speed. One moment, the men were preparing their camp. The next, the first man was gone, dragged into the darkness with a scream that was abruptly cut off. The remaining hunters barely had time to react before the bear charged, a towering mass of muscle and fury, into the clearing. It swiped at the nearest man, its claws tearing through flesh and bone as if they were paper. Panic erupted, rifles were raised, and shots were fired. The bullets hit their mark, but the bear did not slow. It moved with unnatural agility, weaving between trees and using the terrain to its advantage. 9 men were dead within minutes, their bodies scattered and torn apart. Only Robert survived, barely escaping with his life, stumbling through the forest with deep gashes along his arms and back. Robert ran blindly, his vision blurred by panic and pain. The thick underbrush clawed at him as he struggled forward, his breath in ragged gasps. The beast's growls echoed behind him, though he dared not look back. His only hope was to find higher ground where he could hide, even for a moment. His mind raced, the screams of his companions still ringing in his ears. He found himself at the edge of a rocky ledge by sheer luck. With no other option, he climbed, his fingers numb from the cold and slick with blood. The climb was agonizing, each movement a battle against his failing strength. When he finally reached a small overhang, he collapsed, pressing himself against the rock face, listening to the heavy footfalls below. For hours he remained motionless, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The bear lingered, sniffing the air and pacing along the ground below. It knew he was there. It was waiting. The night stretched on, every sound amplified by the silence of the wilderness. He fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep meant death. The bear's breath was thick in the cold air, its guttural snarls a constant reminder of what lurked beneath him. He gripped his rifle, though he knew it would do little against the monster that had already shrugged off bullets. Dawn finally broke, casting pale light over the treetops. The bear was gone. Cautiously, Robert climbed down, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He had to move. He had to get out of the forest before the bear returned. He retraced his steps as best as he could, though the landscape seemed different now, alien, twisted, as if the beast's presence had changed the forest itself. His story sent shockwaves through the hunting community when he finally emerged from the wilderness, half mad with fear and exhaustion. A search party was assembled, but no trace of the bear was ever found. No carcass, no further tracks, only the remains of the camp, the blood-soaked earth a silent testament to what had transpired. Robert never returned to the wilderness. The experience had shattered him, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. He abandoned hunting, left the province, and was never seen in British Columbia again. But the legend of the Phantom of Blackwood Island persisted. Hunters who ventured too deep into the wilderness spoke of an unseen force watching them, an oppressive presence that sent chills down their spines. Some claimed to have glimpsed a shadow moving through the trees, larger than any bear should be. Others spoke of hearing a deep, guttural growl in the dead of night, which made their blood run cold. In the years that followed, strange occurrences continued to be reported. Entire hunting cabins were found torn apart, their inhabitants missing without a trace. Livestock continued to vanish, their remains discovered miles away, mutilated beyond recognition. Some claimed that the bear had never died, that it had simply become something else, something more than a mere animal. A team of researchers attempted to study the area, drawn by the eerie stories. They set up motion sensors and traps, hoping to capture proof of the legendary beast. But after weeks of searching, they found nothing. One night, without explanation, their equipment failed. When they reviewed the data, all they found were strange disturbances in the area, inexplicable malfunctions that defied logic. Some believe the phantom is a force of nature, a guardian of the forest that punishes those who trespass too deeply. Others insist it is merely an unusually large and intelligent grizzly that has learned to evade man's attempts to control it. But those who stood in the shadow of the trees, who had felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them, knew the truth. It was still out there, waiting. Solmaria was a land of raw, untamed wilderness, a place where jagged peaks scraped the sky, vast plains stretched endlessly, and the wildlife was as wild as the landscape. It was a land of myths and legends where the stories of old ranchers and native tribes still lingered in the wind. But among the many tales that haunted Solmaria's past, none was as chilling as that of the grizzly that haunts Solmaria, a beast that terrorized the region on March 2, 1931. Santiago Alvarez had spent his life tending cattle in the rugged Solmarian steppe. He was no stranger to the dangers of the land, pumas, harsh winters, and the ever-present threat of isolation. But he knew something was wrong when his livestock began disappearing under mysterious and violent circumstances. At first, he suspected a pack of wild dogs or even a rogue jaguar, but the brutality of the kills told a different story. Bones crushed, flesh torn apart as if by an animal far larger than anything that should exist in Solmaria. Rumors spread through the local villages. Some claimed a monstrous bear had been sighted deep in the forest, a creature not native to these lands. Others spoke of an escaped circus animal, a grizzly from a distant land that had adapted to its new home, growing larger, stronger, and more cunning. Santiago dismissed these tales as foolishness until he saw the tracks himself. Massive footprints unlike anything he had ever encountered led away from the remains of a mutilated cow. Whatever it was no ordinary predator. Determined to protect his ranch, Santiago gathered a small hunting party including his longtime friend Manuel Perez and 3 other experienced hunters. Armed with rifles, they set out into the wilderness, following the tracks toward the dense forest that lined the base of the Solmarian peaks. They tracked the beast for 2 days, moving deeper into the unforgiving terrain. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of Solmaria, the wind whistling through the grass, the distant cries of condors, faded into an unnatural silence. It was as if the land itself was warning them to turn back. Even the horses, usually indifferent to the dangers of the wild, grew skittish, their ears flicking nervously, as if sensing something the men could not. Then, on the 3rd evening, they found it, or rather, it found them. The attack came without warning. One moment the men were setting up camp near a narrow ravine. The next, the beast was upon them. It moved with terrifying speed for something massive, a shadow of muscle and fury. The first hunter barely had time to react before a swipe of its giant paw sent him flying, his body colliding with a tree with a sickening crunch. The air was filled with the scent of blood, thick and metallic. The remaining men opened fire, their bullets tearing into the creature's thick hide. It roared in rage but did not falter. Another hunter was dragged into the underbrush, his screams echoing into the night before being silenced. Santiago and Manuel ran, hoping to reach higher ground, where the beast's massive form might struggle to follow. They stumbled over rocks and tangled roots, their breaths ragged, lungs burning with effort. Scrambling up a rocky outcrop, they turned to see the devastation below. The camp was in ruins, bodies strewn across the ground. The grizzly, its fur matted with blood, lifted its head and locked eyes with Santiago. It did not pursue. It did not flee. It stood there watching as if daring them to come back down. For hours, Santiago and Manuel remained on the rocks, their rifles useless against a creature that seemed impervious to pain. They barely spoke, too afraid to break the unnatural silence. The wind howled through the valley, but even that could not mask the steady sound of the bear's breathing below. Only when the first light of dawn crept over the mountains did the beast finally vanish into the trees. They never found the remains of their fallen friends. The search parties that later scoured the area found no trace of the bear, only the aftermath of its rampage. But the legend persisted, and to this day, old ranchers still speak of the Solmarian devil. The grizzly that should not have been there yet somehow was. The encounter haunted Santiago and Manuel, and they became reclusive in the following years. Santiago, Once a man of unwavering confidence, refused to return to the highlands. He lived out his remaining years in a quiet village, warning anyone who would listen about the beast that lurked beyond the hills. Manuel, on the other hand, was never the same. The once jovial rancher became paranoid, waking in the middle of the night at the slightest sound, convinced that the bear was still watching him. The villagers continued to report strange occurrences. Entire herds of sheep vanished without a trace, their remains found days later, scattered across the valley. Hunters who ventured too deep into the forest never returned. Some whispered that the beast had grown even larger, adapting to its surroundings in a way no one could comprehend. Others believed it was not of this world, a spirit of the wild, punishing those who dared to challenge it. One fateful summer, a group of European explorers arrived in Solmeria, drawn by the legends. Skeptical of the stories, they dismissed the locals' warnings and set off into the mountains, armed with the finest rifles money could buy. Weeks passed, and when they failed to return, a search party was sent to locate them. What they found sent shivers through even the most hardened ranchers. The explorers' camp had been destroyed. Their supplies were shredded and tents torn apart as if by a force far greater than any storm. Blood stained the ground, but there were no bodies, only massive claw marks embedded in the rocks surrounding the site. A single rifle was found, snapped in half as though it had been nothing more than a twig. There was no sign of the men. It was as if the wilderness itself had swallowed them whole. From that day forward, the legend of the Solmerian devil became more than just a story. It became a warning. Those who lived in the region knew better than to challenge the wild. Even the bravest hunters avoided the cursed valley, refusing to set foot in a land claimed by something beyond human understanding.